This is the Acts 2028 podcast,
where two young Church of God pastors
discuss the challenges and victories we face in leading revitalization.
I am TJ Samuelu.
I am Brian Seidel.
I am in an urban context in Seattle, Washington.
I am in a suburban and rural context in Boise, Idaho.
I am in a liberal state.
I am in a conservative state.
My ministry background is in missions.
My ministry background is in youth ministry.
And yet we are both in our first lead roles.
To help God revitalize the existing church in the Pacific Northwest.
We are helping each other.
And you.
To truly live out Acts 2028.
Well, here we are again for our next episode. Welcome back, TJ. It's great to have you with us again, because you're always with us, but we have somebody with us today that's not usually with us. So, we've arrived again at this season of our first interview of this season. And so, again, welcome, TJ, but more importantly, right, is welcome Pastor Allen Chaney.
Hello, how are you guys?
Doing well. Glad to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
So as we kind of, for our audience that don't know kind of the connection between the three of us, right, is to say we have one thing we all three have in common is we've all shared the same position at the same church, but at different times, right? So that is a part of that. But I will say is, again, I know our relationship, Alan, started a lot of years ago, actually, when I took your job for the first time, because I've taken your job more than once. So,
yep.
Yeah. So that first time was when I was fresh out of college, my first full-time ministry position, when I was hired as the youth pastor at Cloverdale, and you were the youth pastor before me. So that's kind of where our relationship started. And we shared a wall, right? For a few years. Yeah. And I can definitely say, like, as I look back at that time, like I said, that was in, what year was that? 2002? Was that when that?
I think it was 2002, yeah.
So if I think back all those times, and again, I think looking back to that is I know now how much I didn't know then, even though, of course, going into that, I was like, oh yeah, like I know what I'm doing, like no worries, right? I didn't know really what I was doing, but so I say, I know for me personally, that was a huge help for me starting out in ministry to know that I had a youth ministry veteran on the other side of the wall, and so, but again, but then 2 years into that was when I kind of, everything changed, right? It was for our relationship. So,
Yep. Yeah, well, I was the youth pastor, started being the youth pastor here at Cloverdale Church in '96. And like you said, then when you graduated from college, then we were looking for a youth pastor because I was going to be transitioning to the associate pastor. And I think it was right around 2002, it was probably May when you graduated. That you then came on staff as the youth pastor here. And I transitioned to the associate pastor for, I guess it was about, probably 2 years until I then subsequently moved to take the senior pastor position in Reedsport.
So yeah, absolutely. And so and then just kind of, I guess, fill in our listeners on your story. So you moved to Reedsport, Oregon, right on the coast of Oregon. And so again, we also share that we're all have ministered in the Northwest, right? And which again is a part of the premise of our podcast as well. But I think with that said, so you were over there in Reedsport, and that was your first lead role in that church, right?
Yes. Yep. I'd been the youth pastor here at Cloverdale for 6.5 years, approximately 6.5, and then the associate pastor, year and a half, 2 years. And then in July of 2004 was when we accepted and moved to Reedsport Church of God to assume the leadership role there.
So yeah, very good. So and then just kind of fast forward, obviously, to say you were in Reedsport for quite a few years, right?
16.5.
So 16.5 years there. And then, and now more recently, you have moved back to the Treasure Valley. So you are back in Idaho. So again, TJ leaves and then you show up again.
Yeah, back home.
So yeah, absolutely. And so you came back and then stepped back into an associate role at Cloverdale.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
But again, with the express intention, right, that you were going to be moving into the senior pastor role right?
Well,
At
that was
Cloverdale.
the hope. That was the hope. And I appreciate the way Pastor Tom looked at it. He brought me on basically as the executive pastor, as he's, looking towards retirement. And then as we ministered together, if it seemed right, I mean, that was certainly the hope, but we wanted to see if the congregation was going to, be in agreement and accepting of that. And if so, then I would transition at some point into the senior position. Tom would kind of step back into an associate role for a few years, so he's still on staff. But yes, I started April 1st of last year was when I began as the executive pastor, and then everything seemed to be moving along well. And so then he decided to go ahead in the December annual business meeting to have the church vote if they would have me as the next senior pastor. And they voted affirmatively for that. So starting January 1st of this year, then I assumed the senior pastor role over that.
So you're once again back in the lead pastor role. And
Yep.
so, or senior pastor, I guess, depending on your context. I know, as we've kind of joked on the podcast before. I say, like, when I came to Oregon Trail, I changed the title to lead pastor because everybody in the church was older than me, so I didn't feel like a senior or anything. Right. And so, yeah, so again, that's the title I like, is lead pastor. But again, I think at Cloverdale, I don't know, is it still senior pastor?
Who knows? I like the senior or the lead pastor title better, because obviously in a lot of churches today we have seniors pastors, right, who lead the older congregation of our churches, and so it kind of differentiates, I think, between the lead pastor and a seniors pastor, if you will.
Sure, absolutely. So awesome. So so Allen meet TJ, right? TJ, I don't know, you guys never shared a wall, right? So
nope, never shared a wall, but I met TJ several times when we would come back, because Boise's my home. That's where I grew up. And so when we would be back on vacation, those 16 years that we were serving over in Oregon, when TJ was ministering at Cloverdale, we met each other, I think, several times at church services.
Yeah. Also through the connections of Warm and some of those things. And so,
right.
Again, in making it home, got some kids that are at Boise State. So you had some other alliances. Your dad was still in the congregation. And
yes.
So some of those things, yes, there was some connectivity throughout that time. I actually missed that part of hearing him tell me stories about like Mission Aviation Fellowship and some of those things.
Oh,
but going back to,
yeah, he loved it when he was able to volunteer there.
Yeah, so those were some of the fun times. So yeah, no, it's great. Tongue in cheek, it's fun that we've all had a full circle piece in doing that, and like it's progressively getting more. So Allen, there's high expectations that you continue to keep that torch going, because you were like a year and a half to 2 years with Tom in that role. Brian was about a year. I made it 4. Now the sky's the limit. So as now you take that leadership part, or maybe you can defer that to Tommy in the sense of saying, hey, TJ made it at least 4 as the associate. I need you to stick around, big boy, for at least.
There you go. There you go.
So you get that spread out. So anyhow,
may I quote you on that?
You can quote me on that. I just sent you a picture, again, with the connectivity we had, what's funny is they live in proximity, probably about, a mile or so from Brian's church, but they attend Cloverdale. We had Warren and Pauline Koch here on Sunday for our service. So just a couple of days ago, I had a bit of Boise and Middleton in my neck of the woods. So they were here for Sunday for our service. And so we got to reminisce. We took a picture. We sent it to Tommy as well. So there's a lot of overlap. And as you know, like God's, world is so small. And so like just the opportunity and to be encouraged, especially like when you're working the harvest fields of the same area. And so it's so cool to see that come to fruition. And I think kind of one of those things too is, and we can all speak to this from a standpoint. We're all talking about Cloverdale as we've all been there or currently there. But everywhere that we've been, we want to see that ministry continue to flourish. We want it to continue to see kingdom work happening and things for his namesake take place. And so it's always fun to have a connectivity back. I think we even do this in our own culture of, you see things in high school that are like the homecoming game or something. Alan, you've already referred to it in that way. But the homecomings, or those parts where God in our ministry, our testimony, has seen fit to, like Brian said, we thought we knew a lot more maybe at that point. I think it's been described as a 10-year reset. Every 10 years, what we knew as a 20-year-old, we thought we knew everything. Now as a 30-year-old, now as a 40-year-old, I know more than I did so the reality of that is God is faithful. I'm glad that as we've moved, and we talk about, Brian was talking, premise of our show is, there's a lot of things that come with church plants, and you get to start new. And sometimes there is some reprogramming and rethinking, because we all have, not necessarily a bias is a word, but an understanding of what we come to the table, of what church has been to us. When you come to a church that's already established, the revitalization piece of that is just different. And so, like, to be able to speak into that, but to have those relationships, it just really, it creates a different dynamic. And so I'm glad that we all have that. I'm rooting for you guys, obviously from that standpoint, but it's good to have that, even though, again, like, we haven't served on the same staff. We can talk about those things. And Brian and I have talked about circles. You talk about senior pastors. We can't not talk about, say, DB, Don Bertelson, who's leading Joy and stuff at Cloverdale, who was the senior pastor at Oregon Trail. So the list goes on, but really that ministry, the good focus of people really just trying to do that. But like Brian is saying, like, we've talked about ours. Brian comes more and he's kind of shared with you a little bit more of the youth background. I came more from an associate's, more of the global, more missions pastor minded based background. Right. And so I think that's kind of the difference as we process and we work through things and we shift through them. Kind of, what does that mean, and what did that bring to the table? So, Brian, what would you ask Allen right now, as far as kind of one of those questions that we would say?
Yeah. So again, I think one of the reasons we want to talk with you today, and I think for our audience, I just want to acknowledge, and I think we should, as we talk about that, again, we've all worked at the same church, but yet we have these relationships, these connections. I think that, and that's one of the things that I've heard from some of our listeners, right, is that they feel very isolated or alone. And I think that's part of what they can find, even in our podcast and other shows, of realizing you're not alone, right? Realizing that, hey, there is a network of pastors. There are people out there with a similar calling than yours in a different context. And, again, even though we're even spread out, even between states now, to see that, like, there is that important camaraderie that we should have within the body of Christ. And I think even within lead pastors and senior pastors. And, again, we've kind of talked about on the show before, but that was one of my most shocking things, I think, coming, moving out of the youth ministry world into, the senior pastor, lead pastor world, was, especially in the youth ministry context, whether it's through the Church of God, in our Treasure Valley, or even just, nationwide, like, the youth pastors were really good at kind of networking together and, like, encouraging each other and kind of doing those things. And that's what I miss the most. Like, honestly, I mean, I did not miss the pace of youth ministry, right? Getting out of it. Like, I did miss the teenagers. Like, I miss, hanging around teenagers a lot. But the biggest thing, that the hardest thing for me coming out of that transition was I missed that network, that camaraderie, that encouragement that I got from just unity, right, with other youth workers. And so, again, I think that's something that again, like you said, we found in different circles. And I think, but it's something you have to, like, find and seek out, because, again, a lot of lead pastors, senior pastors, right, and unfortunately there can be this mentality of, like, of competition, or of isolation, and those, which, again, I found that, being in the senior pastor world, and it was not pleasant. And so, again, I think it's just awesome, the fact that we can all sit around here and kind of tongue in cheek joke that we've all, had the same position, but, worked at the same church, but at the same time, but we are friends, right? We're colleagues, we're connected. At the very least, we're connected by the blood of Christ, right? With a common mission.
Well, I think I've seen, in my 25 years of ministry, and I hope this is true of others as well. I've certainly been, I think, fortunate and blessed to live in a time where at least I've sensed less competition amongst pastors and more willingness to work together. But it's like you're saying, Brian, it's for those senior pastors who choose to get out there and build those relationships. It's so easy to be so you just overburdened with the ministry, that you're involved in, that it really has to be intentional that you get out and you form those relationships for mutual support, because they don't seem to happen organically, like you said, quite as easily maybe as in youth ministry.
So yeah, absolutely. Again, great point. So I guess, again, if you're listening, you feel isolated, I guess then the takeaway of that is make some effort, right? Like if there's not a pastor's meeting in your area, then facilitate one, right? Like again, reach out, right? I mean, again, show up to our Church of God things, or if you're not in Church of God, go to your denominational things or whatever it is, right? I mean, again, make that effort. Again, there are things I know even within our movement, right? And we have regional conferences coming up. In fact, the one in the West is coming up here. It's literally just a month away, and which I don't know, which actually I think I already know I'm not planning to go to it. I know, Alan, I don't think you are either. So again, there's, we are not trying to be hypocritical by that saying that, right? But again,
I think that we should take advantage of that when we can, but I think probably more important than that, let's see, 7 years ago now, I went on sabbatical. And during my sabbatical, I attended 12 different churches, and I set up with 6 of those churches to then meet with their lead pastor, either before I attended their service or after. And I had a series of questions that I asked all 6 of those pastors just to try and learn what's working in their ministries, what's really bearing fruit for them. And interestingly, 3 of the 6 pastors said that one of the most important things they do for their ministry is that they had about 3 to 4 other pastors, that they intentionally once a year got away with them for a 2 to 3 day little retreat. So I found that very interesting that 3 of the 6 said that intentional, connecting with 2 or 3 other guys. It wasn't over a conference. It wasn't, but it was just them saying that we need that encouragement. We need that support from one another. And they just made it happen. Like I said, 3 of the 6 said, it's one of the most important things I do. And so wow. they were not willing to let the typical isolation of ministry happen. They went out there and made sure that didn't happen. And I was, of all the things I asked, that was clearly one of the key things that I learned from that sabbatical experience, was that 3 out of the 6 said, man, everybody, all pastors need to do that. They were, it was that rewarding and important for their ministry.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. So to say that, so I guess as you take that learning, like, have you done that then since that learning that?
Way to call me out, Brian. No. And I think I actually reached out to you, Brian.
Now you say that, I think I remember you did, and I dropped the ball. So
no, you did not drop the ball. That was me totally, because my intent was to do that. And so I reached out to about 3 pastors just to see, is that something they would be interested in? All 3 of them got back with me and said yes. And that's where she stopped.
And then it never went further. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for bailing me out then, because I was going to take the blame. No, but I think interesting that point, just even in our for a couple previous episodes, right? When we talked about just some of the keys we went over about preaching every week and about, some of the different things that I've found that have really helped me in that process. Again, just one of those things that I talked about in there was how I go away once a year very strategically on a spiritual retreat and, by myself, to just seek the Lord. And again, and one of the things that I do at that time is plan out, my teaching calendar. And so but again, I would say that, I mean, that has been one of the most important things for my ministry, right? And my own personal faith journey and spiritual health has been to go away strategically, for that, 2 or 3 day retreat or whatever it is. So
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think they're both very important. I did the same thing probably about, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. The church council and I, when I was ministering over in Reedsport, just through dialogue, conversation, we kind of all agreed that I needed to do that occasionally as well. It sounds like you do it annually.
yeah,
Our goal back when it was first instituted was that I would once a quarter, I would do a 2 or 3 day personal spiritual retreat. Well, reality was I didn't make it happen every quarter, but I did get pretty faithful at twice a year. And I would totally agree. Those 2 spiritual retreats that I took by myself were just incredibly valuable to my ministry. So I think, one or the other or both, if you can make it happen, absolutely.
yeah, good. Good. So, and again, though, so now to kind of switch gears back into really why we got together today, right? Is to kind of hear your experience and kind of to glean from you some of the things that you learned. I mean, again, through your years of ministry, but especially, I mean, you've worked in well, all of the churches you've been in your ministry tenure have been existing churches. I mean, you've again, you haven't been a church planter, right? So you've
Right.
gone into existing churches.
Right.
And to say that, and I know leaving from when you left Cloverdale, and obviously I was a little more connected to that because, in that point, and you were contemplating that, we were still sharing a wall, right? So,
Sure. Yeah.
Again, and I know as we kind of went through that, but and again, I was not hugely involved, obviously, in your decision, but I was watching you contemplate that, right? And go through. And so again, to say that is, again, you stepped into Reedsport into a kind of very similar context that I stepped into Oregon Trail in, that TJ has stepped into Fairview in,
Gotcha.
to where it was an existing church. I mean, a church that has a rich history in a lot of ways, but yet had kind of turned on struggling times.
Right.
And so, which again is the premise of why we talk, right? Is that we're both in our first lead role positions in existing churches that needed revitalization.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you started into with Reedsport. So I guess just to say that, like, when you picked up, moved your family, right, over to the Oregon coast and stepped into a very rainy context and
not as rainy as everybody thinks, but don't tell
them. Yeah. Well, so TJ, is Seattle as rainy as you thought it would be? Yeah.
Oh shoot.
Yeah.
But again, as you stepped into that, I guess just to say, like what was the Reedsport Church like when you got there? Like, I mean, was it, again, as you kind of walked into that, I mean, was it what you expected when you got there? What was, just kind of, I guess, what did you step into?
Okay. Well, I think the very first thing that was critical to the future success of the church that we saw was that I was coming from a church from Cloverdale and a context and relationship with Pastor Tom that I didn't need a job. I was not looking for another ministry position. I was just searching to see if God was calling me somewhere else. I felt that unsettled spirit that I'm sure you've both felt at times, and I didn't quite know what that was to look like. But I knew and talked. I was very open with Pastor Tom from the very beginning, and I said, I don't know. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, great! I know what that is," because he had felt it years ago as well. And so, as I then began to kind of put my name out there for consideration for churches that needed a pastor, it was then in that context that when Reedsport gave me a call and we began our conversations, we were able to interview each other, I feel, equally. I wanted to make sure that I was the right person for that church just as much as they were hoping to find the right pastor for their church. And so it was this very, I feel, equal process of interviewing each other, being very candid, that really was very helpful in getting that foundation laid so that we had at least the best chance that I could, right? I mean, over a couple of days and phone calls of asking and answering questions, that I could at least get the best vision of what they were about, to know and to pray about whether or not I was to be the right pastor for them. So I think that was critical off the top, because, you know, as you're aware, probably a lot of times when pastors are looking for a new church, they're interviewing for a job as well, you know, and so that kind of has its own bias with it. That thankfully I didn't. I was in a great ministry position. I didn't need to. It was wonderful, you know. So it was truly a mutual, I think, interview process that started the groundwork that then yielded what it did.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and again, we talked about it in previous seasons, but I remember that was one of the keys, even when I was started to talk to Oregon Trail. Again, one of their first questions to me in the interview was, well, why are you looking for a new place? And I'm like, I'm not. Right. Like,
Right.
you know, yeah. And I think the fact that I could tell them, be like, I'm not looking for another job, like, you know, and I think, and that truly was, I think, a turning point, you know, in that process as well, right? For them to realize, like, man, I'm not just here selling myself because I need a job.
Right.
And so,
yeah. Well, and I can remember the question, because the church there had sent me a whole packet of demographic information about the community. It's Oregon coast, so it's largely retirement communities. Whether you're in Astoria, you know, Newport or Reedsport, a lot of those small rural communities on the Oregon coast are largely retirement age folks. And so they sent me that information. I was 33 at the time. And so I just flat asked them, I said, what do you want with a young pastor? I said, you've told me that a majority of your community is seniors and retired. I said, so why are you looking for a young pastor? And they just immediately answered back, well, we feel that all the other churches in town are doing a decent job of ministering to that demographic. No church in town is ministering to the young families, and we would like to fill that gap. We would like to minister to the younger families of our community that we don't think any other church is ministering to. That's why we're talking to you. And that exchange right there was huge for me. I was like, shoot, they know what they're looking for. They've got a real vision and idea. They've looked at their community and they've identified the target audience that they were after. And so a younger pastor fit that. So that impressed me.
So they had a vision and kind of a plan. They knew where they wanted to jump in with that and really engage with their community. And they saw that need and they were willing to respond to it. So maybe take us down. I mean, was that ground level? What did that look like when you arrived there? I'm guessing then your congregation was older in nature, kind of the same thing, but they had this desire to pivot, so to speak, at that point to get younger. What did it kind of look like? I know kind of the being a part by proxy of some of these things where you kind of ended up in your ministry, but what did that, when you came onto the scene of this revitalization and taking this new monumental task that you're like, hey, you know, I mean, some of the uniquenesses that you're equipped with, like you said, you were 33, you have a family, so you had some kids and you had some built-in insulators to kind of help incorporate that into the ministry. But what did that kind of look like? What was you know, ground level look like for the church and when you guys got there? And then kind of set that for us up.
Okay. Well, I think whether it was the first year, and I remember I did the typical thing, you're reading the books. I'm not going to change anything for a year. I'm just going to study the community. I'm going to study the church. I'm going to listen. You know, I'm not going to make any big changes for a year. That was the mentality that I went in with. Didn't wind up happening that way. And I think if I had to boil down whether to answer your question, TJ, of that very first year or my last year there, the key to the success that we saw in Reedsport was because of just basic practical ministry. I mean, very, very basic practical ministry. For some reason, kind of my life and ministry verse has been Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men that they might see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And so I take that really seriously. And So very hands-on practical ministry is what I started with just personally, but then I was the model of it. And so the church just kind of followed suit. Now, you're right, that took some years, to develop. But I think because, scripture says faith without works is dead. So I feel like I've seen a lot of churches, including the one that I grew up in as a child, they did a great job of teaching the scripture. There was nothing wrong with the education that I received. The problem was I never saw any examples of application. And so that's been a big emphasis of my ministry, whether it's Sunday morning preaching or on Wednesday during the week in the office, is I want to be as practical as I possibly can, because all of that biblical head knowledge is of no value if we're not doing something with it. And so when I talk about practical, I mean literally down to the degree of I worked very hard right off the get-go of learning people's names. I cannot overemphasize the importance of that, whether it was my first year or whether it was my last year. Just, it sounds so simple, but what does everybody say about that, right? Oh, I'm horrible at remembering names, right? Everybody says that. Well, everybody then gives them an excuse to not remember other people's names right off the bat. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that. And partly, so Brian, I'll go back to my youth pastor days that you then took over for. I had met a young lady, one of our regular teenagers, brought a friend to youth group on a Wednesday night. And as I tried to do my best, and I certainly don't remember everybody's name, don't get me wrong, but I try. And the next event, like a week later, was we were going to the Newsboys concert. And we were there. I was there with all the kids. Some of them were coming, their parents were going to be dropping them off. Well, this one young lady who had invited this friend the week before, she brought her to the concert. And I can still remember this. They were walking up the stair. We were already in our seats. And they were walking up the stairs to join us. And I didn't even think anything about it. I quite honestly somehow remembered that young lady's name after just meeting her the one time. And I just greeted both the long-term, youth group member and the new member by name. And no joke, that young lady, probably about 15 years old, I probably said her name when she was still 10, 12 stairs below me. She ran up the stairs and gave me a huge hug and said, "You remembered my name." And I've never forgot that. There is something powerful. And I've just watched it happen over and over and over again over the years. I've now had countless people tell me years later, "Do you know why we're coming to Reedsport Church of God? Do you know why we're here?" "No, I'd love to know." "Because you remembered my name." To me, that is just one of those simple, practical ways to express the love and the grace and everything that we read in scripture. Well, how do we express that? Well, the first thing is just remember people's names, and then beyond that, it is just the day-to-day practical things that we can do. I remember I had a couple people tell me years later, they said, "You know why we're coming to your church?" "No, I'd love to hear." "Because we drove by your church and we saw you out weeding the flower bed. And we figured if the pastor can weed the flower bed, that's probably a good church for us to come to." So to go back to your question, TJ, I think whether it was the first year or the last year, the real impact was just simply I was modeling that Jesus bending down, washing feet, whether it was to my church members or the community. We just served in practical ways. And of course, over the years, that then mushroomed into all kinds of things that our church did. But that was the key.
Sure. Well, when I hear that, I hear a couple of things, because we have a background too in teaching, right? So there's this element when I was teaching at Kingsway Christian School at Vancouver Church. there's that, you said something that triggered that for me. It's that application process. It's not just a head knowledge. We know that to be Sadducee, Pharisee kind of thing, biblically speaking as well, but
That's right.
that 18 inches from our head to our heart kind of moment, and putting that into play, because that is, what we see is, God's word in action, as you were
Mhm.
saying. And so
Yeah.
I think there's that. And then when you're talking about that, I also hear this element of, whether you fully accepted that new role in your first time of being a lead pastor, but you were also like pseudo coach or captain of the team. And in either one of those scenarios, whatever one you want to accept, at this point, you're really coach. But coaches create a culture, and then others come alongside them, and that becomes who they are. And we know that in football, sometimes you'll have like the running coach that's just like, we're just going to run the ball, and this is what we're going to do, and this is where our strength is. That hasn't happened with my Seahawks because we haven't had an offensive line, but we won't get into that today. So the reality is that the fact that when you set that bar, that expectation, or this is who we are as an identity, you also kind of, those type of people will gravitate towards you, and it becomes commonplace. And those that don't, they're like, well, maybe I'm not sufficient in that, but man, that really draws at my heartstrings. And I feel like the Holy Spirit's asking me to engage in this way that I never knew that was an expression that I could give back. And so when I hear those things, those are some of the things that I kind of take away with hearing that part of your story in ministry is, those are the pieces. So if you want to see that change and a revitalization, be the change you want to see. I've launched on that in Seattle, where, man, it's difficult. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it of what it is here, and I still get the looks of, why did you come here? Everybody else is going that way. And so, like, I still look like a fish out of water. I got that a lot, but it's kind of one of those things that wherever these people are, like, whether you're, again, if you're listening to this and you're a pastor getting ready, you're pondering, like we've talked about, a new role to go and take an established church, and you're feeling that unsettledness, God's doing something in you. Man, this is one of those times where when you have that calling, it becomes a lot easier. And it sounds like you were able to frame that, both you and Brian, in a context to say, look, here's where I'm at. I'm not doing this because I need a resume builder, because I need a spot. I want to go because, Lord, you're calling me.
Mhm.
And I think, there's been parts, again, from a boy that grew up on this side, more on the coast, going to Idaho. Really, you guys talk about 2000, early 2000, 2002. Really, the news and the chatter coming out of there was difficult. North Idaho was the Aryan race and those things. And as a guy that was of Samoan descent, I thought, what am I really getting myself into? Like, is this Nineveh? And like, I'm really going, and these are not my people. And so, like, as I'm going to those things, but again, God made a way. And as you know, now we can all joke, and we have these warm, intimate feelings about what God has done through the ministry in Boise that we've all been a part of, and in the Treasure Valley, as Brian says. That's the thing, but it's so easy to remember that. And those are the parts, like, I love that because that resonates with my own story. I can't tell you how many times I had to go back, or like you just said in your part of January, where you had to have a vote of confidence to receive that new mantle of this leadership role. I can't tell you how many times in this little over 2 years since I've been leading here that I didn't have to go back and look at things where God affirmed those, because one of our, statements for Church of God is take back what hell has stolen. I'll tell you, Satan's working overtime and he tries to steal us back, but I've had to go back to that affirmative vote. And we were a small church, right? So it was like 42-0. Somehow the preciousness of, even in the group of 42 people, we can't get church people to always align on the same thing. And so I look back on that even as just a simplistic part of, God, you brought us in unity before, you can do that again. And as you call us to where we're going, help make that way clear. And so I love that piece. That's so rich to, because I think we can all take something and apply that to our life and where we've been in ministry. So I just wanted to highlight those things, but thank you for sharing that part of it.
Yeah. Well, I think every pastor feels a calling, right? We wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't a calling. But then it's how do we then take that calling, and how is that going to play out in our ministries? And I think it's very easy. I look back, like I said, in the little church that I grew up in, and he was a very faithful pastor. He was a really good guy. We knew he loved us. We loved him. He did a faithful job of preaching the scriptures, no doubt. The problem was I left church every Sunday feeling completely convinced that what I was being taught was the truth, but I had no idea how to apply it. And so during the week, it caused me, especially when I became a teenager, it caused emotions of guilt and regret and shame, because I didn't feel like I was doing what I knew I was supposed to do, because I was convinced that he was teaching me the truth. So there was this gap of application that once I was able to take that step, and quite honestly, that was here at Cloverdale, when my wife and I first got married and we were looking for a church. We wound up here because as I listened to Pastor Tom preach, he was making that application. And no longer was I having to leave church feeling guilty that I didn't know how to do this. I now was leaving going, well, I can do that. I get that. And so that changed my whole spiritual journey entirely. So I guess that has become, one of my main concerns in ministry now, is to make sure that people are hearing the application, the practical side, so that they can feel the freedom that should be coming from our relationship with Jesus Christ, not a guilt and a burden from the law, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things too, and I just kind of back up at that, but I think it goes back to exactly what you just said, but I think is we as pastors, as church leaders, I think we need to be asking the question of why are people coming? Why are they staying? Right. And what is really changing their life with Christ, right? Like what is truly moving them forward in their faith journey. And again, that's like one of the, again, we have like our well, we call it Journey Class 1, but it's like the, to help our classes that help, spiritual growth classes to help people move forward. And again, our first one is just kind of an intro to the church, and just, what for any other denominations that have a membership, it's their membership class, but we're Church of God, so we don't have that. So, but to say that, so in our Journey Class 1, I always ask people when they come there, I always ask them at the beginning of like, why did you come and why did you stay? Right. And it's really interesting to hear from people of one, how they heard about our church, why they came, and, all that, which is all over the board. But I will say that is the most consistent thing is most of them say they heard about us in lots of different ways, but almost every person that goes through that class says that they looked at our website or watched our live stream before they ever came in person. Oh, and sure. so again, I'll just say like that's been one of the major keys to our growth has been our online presence. So gotcha. To see that, but then beyond that, why they stayed though is even more interesting, right? And to say, and I remember it just triggered for me. Remember that there's been more than one couple that has told me, or family that said they have stayed. Then the main reason why they stayed, like you said, people told you in Reedsport why they stayed, right? Well, because you were weeding the garden, or you were doing or whatever. Like I've had more than one had told me that they stayed at Oregon Trail because after the service, after I kind of give the closing benediction, prayer. And like, I just walk into the back, take my microphone off, I hand it to the sound guy, and I go out into the foyer. Right. And I just stand and talk to people. Right. And just, thanks for coming. So go out the door, whatever. And I've, like I said, people have told me, they're like, we stayed because you do that. Yeah. They're like, because you actually talk to us, and again, and I don't always remember their names. I'm probably not as good at names as you are, but yeah, again, not an excuse to say that, right? But but I'll say it. But again, they're like the fact that the pastor comes out and shakes our hand when we leave, yeah. Right? And says, hey, it's great to see you. Like, and because they said people have told me that they're like, we've gone to so many churches, and like pastors don't do that.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? I don't even understand that. I really don't, because over the years I've had lots of congregation members that go on vacation, and they go to church somewhere when they're on vacation, and they'll come back and they'll say, I now appreciate my church so much more because of its friendly, welcoming spirit, because I just went to church here, there, or wherever, and hardly anybody talked to us. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I guess I've heard it too many times now to know that it must be true. But I don't even get that. Because if our church foyer is not one of the most loving, caring places, then we shouldn't expect people to stay, right? I mean, that's what should those relationships, the feeling that they belong, that we want them there. And when the senior pastor does that, or the lead pastor does that, it's even more powerful. I've had people say that, I can't believe you're out here. And I'm like, wow, okay. That's telling me their past experience was something different, and that their expectation was shattered or something, and they appreciated that I was actually out there greeting people. And that I do remember. I read a book, and I can't tell you the name of the book now, but I remember reading something years ago in which the author was saying, it was a church growth book, and it was talking about how some of the most critical time to connect with people, especially your visitors, is the 10 minutes before church and the 10 minutes after. That, you're only going to get this small window to connect with people, and that most pastors are in a back room somewhere praying with their worship team. And the author made the point, can't you pray anytime so that you can then use that 10 minutes before the service to connect with people? And I remember reading that and just going, that was one of those, duh. Why would you go isolate yourself in a room, even though I get, for a very valid purpose of prayer, but couldn't you have done that 10 minutes prior to the 10 minutes right before church? Well, of course we can. You betcha we can. We can gather our leaders anytime we want and pray for the service that day, so that then we can be available to make those connections, because it's one of those little things. You've heard the saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And if I can take the 10 minutes before and after church every week to make as many connections as I can and speak with people, I've just watched it be huge, just absolutely huge. And then people allowing, the church to continue to minister to them because of that, feeling of they care that I'm here. I feel like I belong, because everybody's looking for that. Everybody's wondering where I fit in, where I belong. And my goodness gracious, it the first and foremost place it should be is the church.
So yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the other things that people might be thinking right now is, how long is this episode? Because we have reached our limit, right? For this first one. So to say that, so we are going to have to do a part 2. So Allen, if you'll hang out, come back with us for the next episode. But if you're listening, we are going to do a part 2 with Allen. And so next time, in next episode, we'll kind of hear some more just kind of logistics of, so how did it really go in Reedsport? We've kind of talked about it, but we'll actually call it out here in the next episode. So come back with us next episode for listening, as we continue our conversation with Pastor Allen Chaney. Acts 20:28. So guard yourselves and God's people. Feed and shepherd God's flock, his church, purchased with his own blood, over which the Holy Spirit has appointed you as leaders. The Acts 2028 podcast is a broadcast production of In His Grip Publishing. Our theme music is Achievement by Giovanni Bruno. We'd love to hear from you on our social media accounts or through email. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram at Acts 2028 Podcast, or send us an email at acts2028podcast@gmail.com. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, leave us ratings and reviews, and even give us your email so you can be notified of new episodes. Thank you for listening, and until next time, we hope that you will lead wherever God has put you, and together we can all live out Acts 20:28 as we serve in the established church.